The chamber doors slammed open before anyone could stop them, and I felt the sound travel through the floor like a small tremor. Every delegate in the Grand Assembly Hall turned at once. I had been mid-sentence, reading a routine amendment to the border resolution, when Claire Bennett rose from her seat without asking for recognition. That alone was enough to silence the room. In 3 cycles of formal negotiation, the human delegation had never once broken protocol. Now their entire party stood, chairs scraping against the polished floor in perfect unison, as if they had rehearsed the motion 100 times before ever stepping into this building. I remember gripping the edge of my desk. My hands, 4 fingers each, tightened until the joints ached. Something in my chest told me this was not a protest. It was not a walkout meant to gain leverage in the next round of talks. It was an ending. Bennett did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The acoustics of the hall carried her words to every corner without effort. "Negotiations are over," she said. "Effective immediately, the human delegation withdraws from all pending discussions with this assembly." For a moment, nobody moved. Then the chamber dissolved into noise. Delegates from a dozen species began speaking over each other, demanding clarification, demanding an explanation, demanding that someone call for order. I sat frozen, watching the human aides gather their materials with the same calm, practiced efficiency they had shown every day of the negotiation. No panic, no anger, just the quiet, terrible certainty of people who had already decided how this would end. I turned to my colleague, an elder Thren diplomat named Corvin, whose scales had gone pale along his throat, a sign of distress among our kind that most other species never learned to notice. He was staring at Bennett with an expression I had never seen him wear before. "They cannot simply leave," he whispered. "There are procedures. There are protocols for withdrawal. This is not how it is done." But Bennett was already walking toward the exit, her delegation falling into step behind her, without a single wasted movement. I called out to her, more out of instinct than any real hope that she would answer. She paused at the threshold of the great doors and looked back at the chamber, not at me specifically, but at all of us, at every species seated in that room who had spent 3 cycles believing they held the advantage. "You had years to speak honestly with us," she said. "You chose delay instead. We are done waiting for you to decide we matter enough to tell the truth." Then she was gone, and the doors closed behind her, with a sound that felt final in a way I could not yet explain. The hall exploded into chaos. Delegates shouted across the aisles. Security officers moved toward the exits, though there was nothing for them to stop. And somewhere behind me, a junior aide from the Thren delegation began weeping quietly, though I never learned why. I sat very still, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed, and found that I could not. 3 cycles of careful, methodical negotiation dissolved in less than a minute, without warning, without a formal notice, without anything resembling the diplomatic customs every other species in this assembly had spent centuries perfecting. I had studied humanity for 6 cycles before this posting. I had read their history, their wars, their long and painful path toward unity as a single species before they ever looked to the stars. I had believed, as most of my colleagues believed, that humans were patient by nature, eager to please, grateful for a seat at this table, after so many centuries, alone in their own solar system. I had believed their calm manner in negotiations was proof of that gratitude. I understood now, sitting in that chaotic hall, that I had been wrong about almost everything. An emergency session was called within the hour. I was summoned along with every other member of the Human Contact Committee, a body that had, until this moment, been considered one of the least demanding postings in the entire assembly. Nobody wanted to sit across from humans and argue about shipping lanes. It was tedious work, filled with long silences and careful, unemotional counterproposals. Nobody had ever imagined it would end like this. The session chamber was smaller than the main hall, built for perhaps 200 delegates rather than the thousands who filled the assembly for major votes. Even so, it was overflowing. Species who had never shown any interest in human affairs suddenly wanted answers. I found myself pressed against a wall near the back, straining to hear the proceedings over the murmur of a dozen different languages being translated at once. The assembly speaker, an ancient Corellian named Thessaly Vorn, called the session to order, with a voice that had commanded silence for over 3 centuries. It took nearly a full minute for the chamber to comply. "We require facts. Vorn said. Not speculation. Not panic. Facts. What do we know? A junior officer from the monitoring division stood to deliver the first report. His hands trembled slightly as he read from a datapad, and I noticed several delegates leaning forward, hungry for information that might explain what had just happened. All diplomatic channels to Earth and its colonies have gone silent, he said. Not disconnected, not blocked, simply unanswered. Every message we send receives an automated confirmation of receipt, and nothing more. We have attempted contact through 17 separate channels, including 3 that were established specifically for emergency communication between our species. None have received a response. And their fleet movements? Vorn asked. The officer hesitated before answering. We do not know. Human vessels have always maintained transponder codes that allow us to track their positions within their own territory. As agreed upon in the original contact treaty, as of 2 hours ago, every transponder signal from every human vessel within range of our sensors has gone dark simultaneously. The chamber erupted again. I understood the reaction, even as I felt it rising in my own chest. In the history of this assembly, no member species had ever disabled its treaty-mandated transponders without a formal declaration of intent to do so. It was considered one of the earliest and most basic signs of aggression, a violation so fundamental that most species had never even needed to write specific consequences for it into treaty law. Nobody had imagined a species would simply do it, silently, all at once, without explanation. I raised my hand, and to my surprise, Vorn recognized me. Delegate Ashan Kell, of the Thren Compact, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I have spent the last 6 cycles studying human history in preparation for this posting. I would like to offer some context, if the assembly will permit it. Vorn gestured for me to continue, and I felt every eye in the chamber turn toward me. Humans are not a species that acts without long consideration, I said. Their history shows this again and again. Every major conflict in their recorded history was preceded by years, sometimes decades, of attempts to resolve disagreements through discussion. They do not withdraw from a negotiating table lightly. When they finally do withdraw, it has never, in any recorded instance, been the opening move of a conflict. It has always been the closing move. By the time a human delegation stops talking, the outcome of what follows has typically already been decided, long before the rest of the world realizes a decision was ever made. The chamber fell into an uneasy quiet. I could see delegates exchanging glances, some skeptical, some clearly disturbed by what I had said. Then what is your assessment, delegate? Vorn asked. What decision do you believe has already been made? I hesitated. I did not want to say the words aloud, as if speaking them might somehow make them more true than they already were. I do not know, I admitted, but I do not believe this assembly should assume we have time to find out slowly. A representative from the Korathi Trade Union, a heavy-set delegate named Ovasa Rel, who had long championed a harder line in negotiations with Earth, rose to object. This is exactly the kind of alarmism that has plagued our relationship with humanity from the start, she said. They are a young species, excitable, emotional. This is almost certainly a negotiating tactic, an attempt to force concessions on the corridor dispute by manufacturing a crisis. I recommend the assembly hold firm and wait for them to return to the table, as they always have before. I wanted to argue with her, but I found I had no evidence strong enough to overrule her confidence. Not yet. The session continued for another 2 hours, cycling through proposals, counter-proposals, and demands for further intelligence, without producing anything resembling consensus. By the time it adjourned, the only decision reached was to convene a historical review committee, tasked with examining humanity's contact-era records for any precedent that might explain what was happening. I volunteered for that committee before Vorn had even finished announcing it. The archive itself was housed 3 levels below the main assembly complex, a vast repository of records collected from every species that had ever sought membership. Human records occupied a surprisingly small section, given how recently they had joined, but what was there was dense, detailed, and largely unread by anyone outside the original contact team. I spent that first night alone in the archive, working through translated documents that most of my colleagues had dismissed as irrelevant historical curiosities. I found myself reading about a period in human history they called the 20th century, filled with conflicts that spanned their entire world. I read about diplomats who spent years in careful negotiation, building alliances and agreements that seemed, on the surface, stable and lasting. I read about the moments, again and again, when those negotiations collapsed, not because of sudden anger, but because one side had quietly reached a limit that the other side had never bothered to notice. I read a passage from a human historian, written centuries before we ever made contact with their species, describing a war that began not with an attack, but with silence. A diplomat had simply stopped answering messages. Weeks later, an entire nation had ceased to exist, in the form it once held. I read that passage 3 times before I understood what it was trying to tell me. Humans did not warn you before they acted. Their warning was the silence itself, and by the time you recognized it as a warning, it was already too late to change what came next. I brought this finding to the committee the following morning, presenting it alongside a dozen similar examples drawn from different periods of human history. The pattern was consistent enough that I could not dismiss it as coincidence. Every time, the withdrawal from dialogue had come after a long period of what humans called diplomatic patience, a willingness to endure slights and delays that would have provoked immediate retaliation from almost any other species I had studied. And every time, that patience had a limit, one that was never announced in advance, one that outside observers only recognized after it had already been crossed. The committee's response to my findings was mixed. Some delegates, particularly the younger members who had joined the assembly more recently, seemed genuinely alarmed. Others, especially those who had built careers on the assumption that humanity was simply a useful and biddable trading partner, dismissed my research as an overreaction built on centuries-old documents that had no bearing on modern human behavior. I did not have the standing to force the issue further. I submitted my report through the proper channels and returned to my quarters that night with a feeling I had rarely experienced in my long career as a diplomat. It was not fear, exactly. It was closer to the sensation of standing at the edge of a great height in darkness, unable to see the ground below, but certain, somehow, that it was much farther away than it appeared. I did not sleep. I lay awake reviewing the timeline of the negotiations, searching for the moment when things had gone wrong, the moment when Bennett's calm expression had begun to shift into something colder. I remembered a session, perhaps 2 weeks before the withdrawal, when a routine procedural matter had come up. A minor human colony, on the edge of the disputed corridor, had submitted a formal complaint regarding an incident with a Karathi trading vessel. I remembered the complaint being filed, discussed briefly, and then quietly set aside as a matter for a lower committee, one that met infrequently and rarely produced timely resolutions. I remembered Bennett asking, almost casually, when that committee was scheduled to review the complaint. I remembered the answer, given without any apparent concern, that it would likely take several more cycles given the current backlog. I had not thought much of the exchange at the time. Now, lying awake in the dark, I could not stop thinking about it. By morning, new reports had reached the committee. Long-range sensor arrays positioned along the border between Thren and human territory had begun registering unusual activity. Civilian shipping lanes that had operated without interruption for years were suddenly closed, their traffic rerouted with an efficiency that suggested weeks of prior planning, rather than a sudden emergency response. Communication traffic within human space had shifted to encryption protocols that our own analysts could not begin to decode, protocols that had never been used, as far as anyone could determine, during the entire span of humanity's membership in the Assembly. I read the reports twice before setting them down, feeling the same cold certainty settle over me that I had felt watching Bennett walk out of the Grand Assembly Hall. Whatever had caused this withdrawal, it had not happened suddenly. It had been building for far longer than any of us had noticed, hidden beneath the surface of careful diplomatic language and procedural delays, waiting for the moment it would finally break through. I did not yet know what that moment would look like, but I understood, with a certainty that settled into my bones and refused to leave, that the galaxy I had known for my entire life was about to change in ways none of us were prepared to face. The Historical Review Committee reconvened at first light, though I doubt anyone among us had truly slept. I arrived early and found Corvan already seated, his pale scales still not fully recovered from the previous day. He was reading through a stack of printed reports rather than using a datapad, a habit he had picked up decades ago and never abandoned. claiming that paper forced him to slow down and think, rather than simply skim for conclusions. "You look as though you have not rested," he said without looking up. "I have not," I admitted. I kept thinking about the complaint, the one from the border colony, filed before the withdrawal. Corven set down his papers. "The trading vessel incident, I remember it. A minor matter, as I recall. Property damage, some injuries, nothing that seemed to warrant urgent attention at the time." "Bennett asked about it," I said. "During a session, she asked when the review committee would address it." I dismissed the question as routine curiosity. Now I am not certain it was routine at all. Before Corven could respond, the chamber doors opened, and Speaker Vorn entered, flanked by 2 aides carrying datapads filled with overnight reports. The ancient Corellian moved to the podium with less of his usual ceremonial slowness, a small detail that told me more about the Assembly's growing concern than any spoken announcement could have. "We have new information," Vorn said, "and none of it brings comfort. I will ask the Monitoring Division to present first." A different officer stood this time, a young Vikrothi woman, whose species communicated partly through subtle shifts in the coloring along her jaw, shifts that betrayed emotions her voice worked hard to conceal. Even from where I sat, I could see the color draining from her skin as she began to speak. "Overnight, we recorded significant fleet movement along 17 separate points of the human border," she said. "Vessels previously stationed at civilian shipyards and defensive outposts have relocated to positions consistent with, though not confirmed as, a defensive perimeter formation. We estimate the total number of vessels involved at no fewer than 400, though our sensor coverage in several sectors remains limited." 400 vessels, Ovasarel repeated from her seat, her earlier confidence noticeably absent. "That is more than triple the fleet strength humanity has ever publicly acknowledged possessing." "Correct," the officer said. "Our previous estimates, based on information voluntarily shared by the human delegation during earlier treaty negotiations, placed their total military capacity at approximately 120 vessels of comparable size and armament. If these new figures are accurate, humanity has been operating with significantly greater capability than they ever disclosed to this assembly." The chamber fell into a heavy silence. I watched delegates who had spent years arguing that humanity posed no meaningful threat exchange uneasy glances with colleagues who had, until this moment, been dismissed as excessively cautious. I felt no satisfaction in being right, only a deepening unease that seemed to settle into the room itself, as though the air had grown heavier in the span of a single briefing. "There is more," the officer continued, her voice growing quieter. "Several human colony worlds along the border have ceased all public network activity within the last 12 hours. This includes commercial broadcasts, educational programming, and personal communication relays typically used by civilian populations. The silence is not limited to official government channels. It appears to extend to the general population as well." "Explain what that means in practical terms," Vorn said. The officer hesitated. "It means an entire civilian population has gone quiet, all at once, without any apparent external cause. We have detected no signs of infrastructure damage, no indication of any crisis that would explain a mandatory communications blackout. The silence appears to be voluntary." I thought of my own findings from the archive, of the historian's words describing a war that began not with an attack but with silence. I raised my hand again, and Vorn recognized me with a small, tired nod. "I would like to suggest an interpretation," I said, "though I want to be clear that it is only a theory, based on patterns I observed in historical human records. Humans, throughout their history, have shown a tendency to withdraw from external engagement during periods when they are preparing for significant action. This withdrawal is not driven by fear or confusion. It is driven by focus. When a crisis reaches a certain threshold, human populations have historically turned inward, setting aside distraction in favor of preparation. I believe what we are witnessing may be exactly that. Not panic, preparation." "Preparation for what?" Rel asked, her voice sharper than before. "I do not know," I said honestly, "but I believe this assembly should stop asking whether humanity intends to act, and begin asking what we did to bring them to this point." The question hung in the chamber for a long moment, before Vorn spoke again. "Delegate Ashan Kell raises a question this committee has, perhaps, been avoiding. I will ask it plainly. Has any member of this assembly, or any species under its jurisdiction, taken action against human interests that has not been properly reported and addressed? Nobody answered immediately. I watched Rel shift in her seat, her expression carefully neutral, in a way that told me more than any words could have. I thought again of the trading vessel incident, of the complaint that had been quietly filed and just as quietly set aside. The Karathi Trade Union has nothing to disclose, Rel said finally, though something in her tone suggested otherwise. Vorn studied her for a long moment before turning back to the full chamber. I am ordering a full audit of every complaint filed by human representatives over the last 3 cycles, regardless of how minor it may have appeared at the time. I want every incident reviewed, every dismissal explained, and every delay accounted for. If this assembly has allowed grievances to accumulate unaddressed, I intend to know exactly how deep that failure runs. The audit began within the hour, and I was assigned to assist, given my familiarity with human historical patterns and my growing reputation, whether deserved or not, as someone willing to say uncomfortable things aloud. The work was slow and exhausting, sorting through years of procedural records, committee minutes, and formal complaints that had been filed by human representatives, and then routed through an administrative system that seemed, the deeper I dug, almost designed to delay resolution rather than achieve it. I found the trading vessel incident again, this time with the full file rather than the brief summary I had seen before. A human cargo vessel, operating under a valid trade agreement, had been intercepted by a Karathi patrol near the disputed corridor. The Karathi officers had boarded the vessel, citing a routine inspection, and in the process had damaged critical navigation systems and caused injuries to 2 crew members, one of whom had required extensive medical treatment upon return to their home colony. The complaint had been filed within days. The response, when it finally came 6 weeks later, offered a formal apology and a modest compensation payment, but made no mention of disciplinary action against the officers involved. I searched further and found that this was not an isolated incident. Over the previous 2 cycles, there had been at least 11 separate complaints filed by human representatives regarding similar incidents along the border, ranging from minor property damage to, in 3 cases, injuries serious enough to require long-term medical care. Each complaint had followed the same pattern: a formal apology, minimal compensation, no meaningful consequence for those responsible. I began to understand why Bennett's question about the review committee's timeline had stayed with me the way it had. She had not been asking out of idle curiosity. She had been testing whether this assembly intended to take her people's concerns seriously, and the answer, delivered through months of bureaucratic delay, had been a quiet and consistent no. I brought my findings to Corven that evening, spreading the compiled records across a table in the small office we had been given for the audit. He read through them in silence, his expression growing more troubled with each page. 11 incidents, he said finally, over 2 cycles, and in every case, the response was inadequate. Not just inadequate, I said. Dismissive. Every complaint was treated as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a grievance to be resolved. I do not believe humanity withdrew from negotiations because of a single incident. I believe they withdrew because they finally understood that no single incident would ever be enough to earn a genuine response from this assembly. Corven set the papers down and rubbed his eyes, a gesture I had rarely seen him make. If this becomes public knowledge, the political consequences will be severe. Several prominent delegates built their careers on managing relations with the Karathi Trade Union. If it comes out that they knowingly allowed these complaints to go unaddressed in order to protect that relationship, there will be no way to contain the fallout. I am less concerned with political fallout, I said, and more concerned with what humanity intends to do next. If my theory is correct, and this withdrawal represents the end of their patience rather than a temporary disruption, then we are no longer negotiating from a position of leverage. We are negotiating, if we can even call it that anymore, from a position of consequence. Neither of us had an answer for what came next. We worked through the night, compiling a full report for Vorn's review, documenting every incident, every delay, every quiet failure that had accumulated over 2 cycles into something that now threatened to reshape the entire structure of the Assembly's relationship with humanity. By the time I finally left the office, the first light of the station's simulated dawn was beginning to filter through the observation windows along the corridor. I paused there for a moment, looking out at the vast expanse of stars beyond the glass, searching instinctively for some sign of the fleet movements the monitoring division had described. I saw nothing, of course. The distances involved were far too great for anything to be visible with the unaided eye. But I found myself thinking about Bennett's words as she left the chamber, about years of delay, and a species finally deciding they mattered enough to demand honesty. I thought about the 11 incidents, the quiet dismissals, the slow accumulation of grievances that none of us had bothered to take seriously until it was far too late to undo the damage. I did not know, standing there in the pale light of that artificial dawn, that within another day, we would have far more pressing evidence of exactly how seriously humanity had taken all of it. I was reassigned the following morning, along with a small monitoring team, to a listening post positioned along the border between Thren territory and the disputed corridor. Vorn had ordered a rotation of experienced personnel to every observation station within range of human space, hoping to gather first-hand intelligence, rather than relying solely on automated sensor reports. I had not expected to be chosen for field assignment, given my background in diplomatic research rather than military observation, but Vorn had specifically requested me, citing my familiarity with human behavioral patterns as a valuable asset for interpreting whatever we might witness. The listening post itself was a modest station, built decades earlier during the early years of contact, when the border had been little more than a formality between two curious but cautious neighbors. I arrived alongside 4 other observers, including a young Karathi technician named Oves Dahl, who seemed nervous in a way that suggested he understood, perhaps better than most, the weight of what his people's actions might have contributed to the current crisis. I did not know about the incidents, he told me quietly, not long after we arrived, as we settled into the cramped observation deck. The ones from the audit, I want you to know that. Most of us in the fleet had no idea our officers were behaving that way toward human vessels. I studied him for a moment, uncertain how much comfort to offer. I believe you, I said finally, but I do not think that will matter much to the people who were injured, or to the delegation that just walked away from 3 cycles of negotiation. He said nothing further, and we settled into the long, tense work of monitoring the border. The first day passed with little incident beyond routine sensor readings, though even those readings carried an unsettling quality. Civilian shipping lanes that had once carried a steady flow of traffic between our territories sat almost entirely empty. The few vessels that did appear moved with unusual caution, altering course well before reaching any point that might have brought them within range of human patrol routes, as though their captains had received private warnings that the rest of us had not. On the second day, we began detecting encrypted communication bursts along frequencies we had never before observed in human transmissions. Our analysts could not decode the content, but the pattern itself told a story of its own. Regular, methodical, spaced at intervals that suggested a coordinated operation rather than a scattered response to uncertainty. Whatever the humans were preparing, they were preparing it with the same calm precision Bennett had shown when she walked out of the assembly hall. I spent much of that second day reviewing additional historical records I had brought with me, searching for any further insight into what might come next. I found an account describing a period in human history when 2 rival nations had spent years locked in careful, tense negotiation over a divided border, each side building military strength while publicly claiming to seek peaceful resolution. The account described how, when negotiations finally collapsed, neither side had launched an immediate offensive. Instead, they had spent weeks simply demonstrating capability, moving forces into visible positions, allowing the other side to fully understand the scale of what they now faced before any further action was taken. I began to wonder if we were witnessing something similar, a slow, deliberate demonstration, rather than the opening stages of open conflict. The theory offered some small comfort, though I understood even as I formed it that a demonstration of capability from a species with 400 previously undisclosed warships was not, by any reasonable measure, a comforting thought. On the third day, everything changed. I was reviewing overnight sensor logs when Dahl called out from across the observation deck, his voice tight with an urgency that immediately drew my full attention. "Long-range contact," he said. "Single vessel, emerging from transit at the edge of our sensor range. I moved to his station immediately, watching as the readings populated across his display. A single vessel. My first instinct was relief, given the fleet numbers we had been tracking, until I saw the size classification attached to the contact. "That cannot be correct," I said, staring at the numbers. "No single vessel should register that mass." Dahl's hands moved quickly across his console, running the readings through a secondary verification process, hoping, I think, that the initial numbers had been some kind of sensor error. The confirmation came back unchanged. Whatever had just emerged from transit at the edge of our territory was larger than anything either of us had ever encountered. Larger, in fact, than anything cataloged in any assembly database regarding human vessel classifications. "Contact the main station immediately," I said. "Vorn needs to know about this before it comes any closer." The message went out within minutes, though I doubted it would reach the assembly before the vessel's own presence became impossible to ignore. I watched the readings continue to update as the ship held its position at the edge of our sensor range, making no attempt to advance further into contested space, making no attempt to communicate, simply sitting there, silent and enormous, in a way that felt far more unsettling than any aggressive maneuver could have. "Why is it just sitting there?" Dahl asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I did not have an answer for him. I thought back to my research, to the pattern of demonstration rather than immediate action, and wondered if this was exactly that. A single vessel, positioned at the edge of visibility, allowing us time to understand what we were looking at, before deciding what, if anything, to do about it. We monitored the contact for the remainder of that day, and through the night that followed, watching as additional sensor data slowly refined our understanding of the vessel's specifications. It carried power signatures that our analysts could not fully explain, patterns that suggested technology far beyond anything humanity had ever demonstrated during their years of assembly membership. I found myself thinking again of the 11 incidents documented in our audit, of officers who had boarded human vessels assuming an easy advantage over a species they believed to be technologically inferior in every meaningful way. I wondered how many other assumptions the assembly had made about humanity, over the years, that were about to prove just as dangerously wrong. On the fourth day, Vorn called an emergency session, this time including every listening post along the border via secure relay, so that observers like myself could report directly, rather than through delayed written summaries. I described the contact in as much detail as our instruments could provide, watching the reaction ripple through the assembled delegates even across the imperfect quality of the relay feed. "Has it made any attempt at communication?" Vorn asked. "None," I said. "It has held its position without variation for approximately 31 hours. No hailing signals, no diplomatic transmissions, nothing beyond its continued presence." "And your assessment, delegate?" I considered my answer carefully before speaking. "I believe this vessel is not intended as an immediate threat, in the sense of imminent action. I believe it is intended as a statement. Humanity has shown us, through 11 years of documented incidents, that they were willing to endure a great deal before reaching this point. I believe this vessel is meant to demonstrate, without a single word spoken, exactly what that patience had been protecting us from." The chamber fell silent, and I could see, even through the imperfect relay, the weight of that statement settling over every delegate present. Rel, who had spent the previous session insisting this was nothing more than a negotiating tactic, said nothing at all, her earlier confidence entirely absent from her posture. Vorn was quiet for a long moment before responding. "We will not act rashly," he said finally. "But I want every diplomatic channel we have attempted to keep open, and I want a formal apology prepared, addressing the incidents uncovered in our audit, ready to be transmitted the moment any human representative responds to our attempts at contact. We caused this. I believe it is long past time we admitted that plainly, rather than continuing to search for some external explanation that allows us to avoid responsibility." It was, I thought, the first genuinely honest statement I had heard from assembly leadership since the withdrawal began. The session continued for another hour, cycling through logistical concerns and further reports from other observation posts, none of which offered anything as significant as the vessel Dahl and I had detected. By the time it concluded, exhaustion had settled over every member of my small team. though none of us dared to rest while that massive, silent presence remained at the edge of our sensors. I stood at the observation deck's viewport late that night, staring out into the darkness in the vessel's general direction, though I knew it was far too distant to see with unaided sight. I thought about Bennett's words again, about years of delay finally reaching their limit. I thought about the historian's account of a war that began not with an attack but with silence, and I understood now, with a clarity I had not possessed even a few days earlier, that we had misread that lesson from the very beginning. The silence had never been the beginning of the war. The silence was humanity giving us one final, unmistakable chance to understand what we had already done, before they decided what would come next. Dahl joined me at the viewport sometime later, his earlier nervousness replaced by something quieter, more resigned. "Do you think they will attack?" he asked. I thought carefully before answering, choosing my words with the same care Bennett had shown when she addressed the entire assembly. "I think," I said, "that humanity has already shown us more restraint than we ever showed them. I think the question is no longer what they intend to do. I think the question is whether this assembly is finally willing to become worthy of that restraint." Neither of us had an answer, and we stood together in silence, watching the stars, waiting for whatever would come next. By the 5th day, the single vessel was no longer alone. I woke to Dahl shaking my shoulder, his face pale in the dim light of the observation deck. I had allowed myself only a few hours of rest, curled awkwardly in a chair rather than risk missing anything significant, and I sat up immediately at the sight of his expression. "More contacts," he said, 6 of them, emerging at staggered intervals over the last 20 minutes, all holding position near the first vessel. I moved to the main display, watching the readings populate one after another. None of the new arrivals matched the size of the first ship, but each was still larger than anything we had previously catalogued from human forces, and their formation carried an unmistakable deliberateness. They arranged themselves in a wide arc around the original vessel, not advancing, not retreating, simply establishing a presence that could no longer be dismissed as a single unusual anomaly. "Send the update to the main station," I said, though Dahl was already doing exactly that, his fingers moving quickly across his console. "And begin a continuous log. I want every change in their positioning recorded, no matter how small." Word of the expanded fleet reached every observation post along the border within the hour, and by midday, similar reports began arriving from stations positioned along entirely different sections of human territory, far from our own. Vorn called another emergency session, this one drawing a larger crowd than any I had witnessed since the original withdrawal, as delegates who had previously shown little interest in human affairs now scrambled for information. I attended via relay once again, watching the chamber grow more crowded with each passing minute. Rel was present, though she said nothing during the opening reports, her expression carefully composed in a way that reminded me of someone rehearsing an explanation they hoped they would never need to give. The monitoring division's lead officer, a weary-looking Corellian named Baston Orr, delivered the primary briefing. "We are now tracking confirmed fleet presence at 11 separate points along the border," he said. "Total vessel count across all locations exceeds 600, a number significantly higher than even our revised estimates from 3 days ago. None of these formations have advanced beyond their current positions. None have made any attempt at communication." "What is your assessment of intent?" Vorn asked. Orr hesitated before answering. "Containment," he said finally. "Every formation we have observed positions itself in a manner consistent with establishing a perimeter, rather than preparing for offensive movement. If I had to offer a single word for what we are witnessing, it would be that humanity is not preparing to invade. They are preparing to ensure nothing crosses their border without their explicit permission, in either direction." A murmur moved through the chamber, and I understood the mixture of relief and renewed anxiety it carried. Containment was not conquest, but it was also not the behavior of a species preparing to quietly return to the negotiating table once their grievances had been addressed through the usual channels. It was the behavior of a species that no longer trusted anyone outside their own borders, and had decided, deliberately and without apology, to act on that distrust. I requested to speak, and Vorn granted it. "I believe this confirms what I suggested several days ago," I said. "This is not the beginning of an offensive campaign. It is a demonstration, intended to ensure this assembly fully understands the consequences of continued inaction." I would also add that containment of this scale requires resources and coordination that could not possibly have been assembled in the days since the withdrawal. This was planned, extensively, long before Director Bennett ever stood up in the Grand Assembly Hall. How long before? A delegate from the outer systems asked, his voice tight with barely concealed alarm. Based on the scale of what we are observing, I said, I would estimate planning began at minimum several months prior to the withdrawal, quite possibly longer. Which suggests humanity gave this assembly every opportunity to resolve the underlying grievances through ordinary diplomatic channels, while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that we would fail to do so. The chamber grew quiet again, and I watched several delegates exchange glances that carried the particular weight of people realizing, all at once, that they had spent months, perhaps years, dismissing warning signs that had been visible all along, if only they had bothered to look. Vorn addressed the chamber directly, his ancient voice carrying an authority that seemed, for the first time since the crisis began, to command genuine attention rather than simple procedural compliance. I have reviewed the audit compiled by the Historical Review Committee, he said. 11 documented incidents over 2 cycles, each involving harm to human citizens or property. Each met with a response so inadequate that I am, frankly, ashamed to have presided over an assembly that allowed it to happen. I do not believe humanity's actions over the past 5 days represent an unreasonable response to a pattern of neglect this severe. I believe they represent remarkable restraint, given what other species in this assembly might have done under similar circumstances. Rel finally spoke, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. The Karathi Trade Union takes full responsibility for the incidents involving our patrol officers, she said. I was aware of at least 4 of these complaints at the time they were filed. I made the decision to route them through standard administrative channels, rather than escalating them for immediate review, believing the matters to be minor, and the risk of diplomatic friction with humanity to be low. I understand now how significantly I misjudged that risk, and I offer my full cooperation with any further investigation this assembly deems necessary. It was, I thought, an unusually direct admission from a delegate who had spent years cultivating an image of unshakable confidence. I wondered what it had cost her to say it aloud, in front of the full assembly, knowing the political consequences that would inevitably follow. Vorn accepted her statement without visible satisfaction, his expression remaining grave. Accountability within this assembly will proceed through proper channels, once this immediate crisis has been addressed, he said. For now, our priority must be re-establishing communication with humanity, by whatever means remain available to us. I am authorizing a formal delegation to attempt direct contact with the vessels positioned along the border, carrying a complete and unedited copy of our audit findings, along with a formal apology addressing every documented incident. The session continued for another hour, working through the logistics of assembling such a delegation, though I found my attention drifting back to the observation deck, to the silent ships holding their positions along a border that had, until recently, existed as little more than a formality between 2 curious neighbors. I was selected, along with Corven and 3 others, to accompany the delegation as advisors, given our familiarity with human historical patterns and our direct involvement in compiling the audit. We departed from the main station within 2 days, traveling aboard a small diplomatic vessel, escorted by a modest honor guard that Vorn had insisted upon, though I suspected even he understood how little that escort would matter if humanity had decided our overtures were no longer welcome. The journey to the border took the better part of a day, and I spent much of it reviewing the full audit report one final time, searching for anything we might have missed, any detail that could help us understand exactly what we needed to say when we finally stood before a human representative again. Corven spent most of the journey in quiet contemplation, occasionally asking me questions about specific historical patterns I had researched, as though trying to prepare himself for a conversation he feared he might not survive with his composure intact. "Do you believe they will speak with us?" he asked, not long before we reached the border. "I do not know," I admitted. "But I believe, if there is any chance of averting further escalation, it depends entirely on whether we can demonstrate that we finally understand the difference between an apology offered out of genuine accountability and an apology offered simply to avoid consequences." Corven nodded slowly, though I could see the uncertainty still weighing on him. And if they do not accept that distinction? I did not have an answer for him, and we sat together in silence for the remainder of the journey, watching through the small viewport as the stars gradually gave way to the looming silent shapes of the human fleet, waiting for us at the edge of a border that no longer felt like the safe and familiar boundary it had once been. As our vessel approached the perimeter, I felt a tension settle over the entire delegation that I had never experienced in my years of diplomatic service. We were not approaching a negotiation table this time. We were approaching a judgment, delivered by a species that had spent years demonstrating patience we had never earned, and had finally, after everything, decided to show us exactly what the absence of that patience looked like. I hoped, more than I had ever hoped for anything in my long career, that we were not already too late to change what came next. Our vessel was stopped well before it reached the outer edge of the human formation, a single request for identification arriving over an open channel in a calm, measured voice that carried no hostility, but also no warmth. I recognized something in that tone immediately, a discipline that reminded me of Bennett's own composure in the moments before she walked out of the Grand Assembly Hall. Corven handled the initial exchange, identifying our vessel, our purpose, and the nature of the materials we carried. There was a long pause after he finished speaking, long enough that I began to wonder if we would receive any response at all. Then the voice returned, instructing us to hold position and await further contact. We waited for nearly 3 hours. I spent much of that time standing near the viewport, watching the nearest human vessel, a ship easily 4 times the size of our own diplomatic transport, hold its position with a stillness that felt almost deliberate in its patience. I found myself thinking about how differently this moment would have unfolded only 2 weeks earlier, when I still believed, as most of my colleagues believed, that humanity's calm manner reflected gratitude rather than genuine restraint. When contact finally came again, it was not the same voice as before. This time, the transmission opened with a video feed, and I found myself looking at a woman I did not immediately recognize, though something in her bearing told me she held significant authority. She introduced herself as Colonel Grace Whitmore, commanding officer of the fleet formation, positioned along this section of the border. "You have requested to deliver materials to our command," she said. "Before we proceed further, I want to be clear about the terms of this exchange. We will accept your materials for review. We will not engage in further negotiation at this time. Director Bennett has made clear that formal dialogue with the Assembly remains suspended until certain conditions are met. I am not authorized to discuss those conditions, only to confirm that this delegation's materials will be reviewed and considered." Corven exchanged a brief glance with me before responding. "We understand," he said. "We ask only that our materials receive genuine consideration, and that we be given the opportunity to answer any questions your command may have, once that review is complete." Whitmore studied him for a long moment through the video feed, her expression unreadable. "That request will be forwarded," she said finally. "Transmit your materials now." We sent the full audit report, along with Vorn's formal apology, and a supplementary statement I had drafted myself, describing in detail the historical patterns I had identified, and the ways in which this assembly had failed to recognize the significance of humanity's patience until it was nearly too late. I did not know if any of it would matter, but I found some small comfort in having said it plainly, rather than allowing our delegation's silence to compound the very failure we were attempting to address. The wait that followed was longer than the first, stretching well into the following day. I slept poorly aboard the cramped diplomatic vessel, my mind returning again and again to the audit findings, searching for anything that might explain the specific breaking point that had finally driven humanity to withdraw entirely from dialogue. 11 incidents over 2 cycles was damning enough, but I could not shake the feeling that something more specific, some particular moment, had tipped the balance from patience into this current, silent standoff. I found my answer late on the second day, though not through any deliberate search of my own. Whitmore's voice returned over the comm channel, requesting a direct conversation with our delegation, rather than a simple exchange of recorded materials. Corven accepted immediately, and we gathered in the vessel's small conference space to receive the transmission. Whitmore appeared again, though this time she was joined by another figure I did recognize immediately. Bennett herself sat beside the colonel, her expression carrying the same calm, unshakable composure I remembered from the Grand Assembly Hall. though something in her eyes suggested a weariness that had not been visible before. "Delegate Ashan Kell," Bennett said, addressing me directly, which I had not expected. "Your supplementary statement was read carefully. I want to ask you something, and I would appreciate an honest answer, rather than a diplomatic one." "I will do my best," I said. "Do you know why the withdrawal happened when it did?" she asked. "Not the pattern of incidents your audit uncovered, though those were certainly part of it. I mean the specific moment. Do you know what finally convinced us that continued dialogue with this assembly had become pointless?" I hesitated, uncertain how to answer honestly without simply guessing. "I do not," I admitted. "I have theories, based on historical patterns, but I do not know the specific event you are referring to." Bennett nodded slowly, as though my honesty had confirmed something she already suspected. "There is a colony," she said, "small, agricultural, positioned near the edge of the disputed corridor. Its population is just under 4,000 people. 3 months ago, a survey team from an assembly member species entered that colony's territory without authorization. Conducting resource assessments on land the colony had spent 2 decades cultivating. When colony representatives raised concerns through proper channels, they were informed that the territory in question had been reclassified as unaligned space during a procedural review that occurred without their knowledge or consultation, a review buried within a routine committee report that received no meaningful attention from anyone in this assembly. I felt a cold weight settle into my chest as she continued. "The colony filed a formal objection," Bennett said. "It was acknowledged, logged, and scheduled for review by a subcommittee that, according to your own audit findings, meets only twice per cycle and carries a substantial backlog. The estimated timeline for resolution, according to the response the colony received, was no fewer than 14 months. 14 months, delegate, for a community to learn whether the assembly considered them to still be citizens of their own home." "I was not aware of this incident," I said quietly. "It was not included in the audit I helped compile." "I know," Bennett said, "because it was never formally logged as a complaint against a member species. It was logged as an internal territorial reclassification matter, which meant it never crossed paths with the incidents your committee was investigating. We only discovered the connection ourselves, after conducting our own review of every unresolved grievance filed by human citizens or colonies over the past 3 cycles. What we found was not 11 incidents, delegate. It was 43, spanning every category of harm this assembly claims to take seriously. Every one of them buried within some procedural classification, designed, whether intentionally or not, to ensure it never received the attention it deserved. The number struck me with a force I had not anticipated. 43. I thought of the careful, methodical audit my committee had compiled, the 11 incidents we had believed represented a significant and troubling pattern, and understood now that we had barely begun to see the true scope of what this assembly had allowed to accumulate, unaddressed, for years. "I understand now why you withdrew," I said, and found that I meant it completely. Bennett studied me for a long moment before responding. "I did not tell you this to shame your delegation further," she said. "I told you because I believe, based on your supplementary statement, that you are one of the few voices within this assembly who has genuinely tried to understand what brought us to this point, rather than simply managing the crisis it created. I want you to understand something clearly. We did not withdraw from negotiations because we wanted conflict. We withdrew because we finally understood that this assembly's version of diplomacy was never designed to resolve our grievances. It was designed to manage them until we grew tired of asking, and simply accepted the status quo, the way we had been quietly expected to for years." "What would change that?" I asked. "What would this assembly need to do to convince your government that genuine dialogue is possible?" Bennett exchanged a brief glance with Whitmore before answering. "Transparency," she said. "Complete and immediate transparency regarding every unresolved grievance currently buried within your procedural systems, human or otherwise. Accountability for those who allowed this pattern to continue, not through quiet reassignment, but through genuine consequence. And a fundamental restructuring of how this assembly handles complaints from smaller or newer member species, so that no community, human or otherwise, is ever again told that their safety and their rights our matters requiring 14 months of patient waiting. I thought of Vorn's own words during the emergency session, of his admission that the Assembly's failures had earned this response rather than provoked an unreasonable one. I thought of Rel's uncharacteristic honesty, of the growing recognition among delegates that the crisis we now faced had been years in the making, hidden beneath layers of procedural language that had allowed everyone involved to avoid genuine responsibility. I will carry this message back to the Assembly personally, I said, and I will do everything within my ability to ensure it receives the response it deserves, rather than another round of careful, empty apologies. Bennett studied me for a long moment, and for the first time since our conversation began, something in her expression softened, just slightly, into what I recognized as cautious, guarded hope. "I would appreciate that, Delegate," she said. "More than you know." The transmission ended shortly after, and I sat alone in the conference space for a long while, turning her words over in my mind. 43 incidents. A colony that had spent months not knowing whether it still belonged to itself. A pattern of neglect so consistent, so deeply embedded within the Assembly's procedural structure, that it had taken a species willing to disable its own transponders and mobilize 600 vessels before anyone had bothered to look closely enough to see it. I understood, sitting there in that small, quiet room, that whatever came next would depend entirely on whether the Assembly I served was finally willing to become something other than what it had always been. I returned to the Assembly station 2 days later, carrying with me not only the recorded conversation with Bennett, but a growing sense of urgency that I had never felt in all my years of diplomatic service. Corvan accompanied me directly to Vorn's chambers, bypassing the usual scheduling procedures entirely, a breach of protocol that would once have been unthinkable, but now felt entirely justified given the circumstances. Vorn received us immediately, his expression grave as he listened to the recording in full silence. When it finished, he sat quietly for a long moment, his ancient hands folded in front of him, before finally speaking. 43 incidents, he said. I authorized the audit believing 11 was already a significant failure. I cannot begin to express how deeply this number troubles me. There is more, I said. The colony Bennett described, the reclassification issue. I have already begun searching our procedural records for similar cases, using the pattern she described as a guide. I believe we will find additional incidents that were never properly logged as complaints against member species, precisely because they were buried within routine administrative processes, rather than formal grievance channels. Vorn nodded slowly. Then we must find them all, he said. Everyone. I will not present this assembly with another partial accounting of our failures. If we are to have any hope of restoring genuine dialogue with humanity, we must demonstrate a transparency this institution has never before attempted. The search that followed consumed nearly a full week, drawing in dozens of additional researchers from across multiple committees, each tasked with reviewing procedural records for any pattern resembling the buried reclassification Bennett had described. What we found exceeded even her own accounting. 61 separate incidents, spanning not only human grievances but similar patterns affecting several smaller member species, all quietly absorbed into administrative processes that had, whether by design or simple institutional neglect, ensured they never received the scrutiny they deserved. Vorn called for a full assembly session, the largest gathering I had witnessed in my entire career, drawing representatives from every member species, regardless of their direct involvement in human affairs. Word of the crisis had spread far beyond the diplomatic circles that had originally handled it, reaching civilian populations across dozens of worlds through independent news channels that had been tracking the story since the initial withdrawal. I stood near the back of the chamber as Vorn addressed the assembled delegates, his voice carrying a weight I had never heard from him before. I have called this session, he said, not to discuss strategy, or leverage, or negotiating position. I have called this session to admit, plainly and without qualification, that this assembly has failed the very species it claims to represent and protect. 61 documented incidents, spanning multiple member populations, each buried within procedural systems designed to manage grievances rather than resolve them. I bear personal responsibility for presiding over an institution that allowed this pattern to continue as long as it did, and I intend to answer for that responsibility fully, once this immediate crisis has been addressed. The chamber remained silent as he spoke, a silence unlike any I had witnessed during the earlier sessions, heavy with the particular stillness of an audience finally confronting something it could no longer avoid. I watched delegates who had spent years building careers on the Assembly's carefully managed image sit in visible discomfort, some clearly grappling with the reality that their own committees had contributed, directly or indirectly, to the failures now being laid bare before the entire chamber. Vorn continued, outlining a series of reforms he intended to propose, including an independent review board with authority to escalate grievances beyond the reach of any single committee's discretion, mandatory response timelines enforced by binding procedural rules rather than voluntary compliance, and a permanent audit division tasked with continuously monitoring for exactly the kind of quiet administrative burial that had allowed 61 incidents to accumulate unnoticed. The proposal did not pass without resistance. Several delegates, particularly those representing larger and more established member species, raised concerns about the precedent such sweeping reforms might set, arguing that the Assembly's procedural flexibility had historically served its diverse membership well, allowing for nuanced handling of complex disputes, rather than rigid, one-size-response frameworks. I understood their concerns, even as I found myself deeply skeptical of arguments that seemed, at their core, more concerned with preserving institutional convenience than addressing genuine harm. Rel, notably, spoke in favor of the reforms, her earlier admission of responsibility apparently having reshaped her approach to the crisis entirely. "I built my career within this Assembly's existing structure," she said during the debate. "I benefited from its flexibility, and I now understand that flexibility came at a cost I was never willing to fully examine. I support these reforms, not despite the discomfort they will cause established interests, but because of it. This Assembly does not need more convenience. It needs accountability." The debate stretched across 3 full days, but by its conclusion, Vorn's reform package passed with a substantial majority, along with an additional resolution authorizing full public disclosure of every incident uncovered during the audit, to be transmitted not only to human authorities, but broadcast openly across every Assembly member channel, ensuring no population, human or otherwise, would ever again wonder whether their grievances had been taken seriously. I was present when that broadcast was finally transmitted, standing in the same observation gallery where I had first watched Bennett walk out of the negotiations that now felt like a distant memory from another lifetime. The broadcast detailed every incident, every delay, every quiet failure the audit had uncovered, presented without the careful diplomatic language that had once characterized Assembly communications, replaced instead by a directness that felt, to me, like the first genuine step toward the transparency Bennett had demanded. The public reaction across Assembly worlds was immediate and, in many places, furious. Protests erupted on several member worlds, populations demanding to know why their own governments had allowed such patterns to continue unaddressed for so long. Several prominent officials, including 2 members of the original review subcommittee responsible for the buried colony reclassification, announced their resignations within days of the broadcast, facing investigations that would ultimately determine whether their failures had been the result of simple negligence or something more deliberate. I watched the reaction unfold with a complicated mixture of relief and continued unease. The transparency Bennett had demanded was finally happening, but I understood, even as I watched it unfold, that transparency alone would not be enough to undo years of accumulated harm, nor would it, on its own, convince a species that had mobilized 600 warships that words alone could be trusted again. 3 days after the broadcast, a new transmission arrived from the border, this time addressed directly to Vorn rather than routed through any subcommittee. I was summoned to attend the response session, given my continued involvement in the crisis, and found myself once again standing in a chamber filled with anxious delegates, waiting to learn whether our efforts had been enough. Bennett appeared on the main display, her expression carrying the same careful composure as before, though I thought I detected something new in her bearing, a cautious openness that had not been present during our earlier conversation at the border. "We have reviewed your public disclosure," she said, addressing the full Assembly rather than any single delegate, "and we have reviewed the reform measures your session approved. I want to be clear that we do not consider this crisis resolved, simply because words have finally been spoken honestly. Trust, once broken as thoroughly as it has been between our peoples, is not restored through a single broadcast or a single legislative session. It is restored through sustained action, demonstrated consistently, over time. Vorn rose to respond, his ancient voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "We understand," he said, "and we do not ask you to trust us based on words alone. We ask only for the opportunity to demonstrate, through consistent action, that this assembly is capable of becoming the institution it should have been from the beginning of our relationship. What would you require to consider that opportunity worth extending?" Bennett was quiet for a long moment before answering, and in that silence, I felt the entire chamber hold its breath, waiting to learn whether the galaxy we had known was about to change permanently, or whether some fragile path back toward genuine cooperation might still remain open before us. "Time," Bennett said finally, "and oversight. We will maintain our current fleet positions along the border for the duration of one full cycle, not as a threat, but as a measure of caution, while we observe whether these reforms produce genuine results, rather than another round of carefully managed appearances. During that period, we request permanent representation on your newly established independent review board, with full access to every grievance filed by any member species, human or otherwise. Not as an act of distrust toward your institution alone, but as a demonstration that oversight from outside a system is often the only way to ensure that system remains honest with itself." Vorn considered the request carefully before responding. "I believe that is a reasonable measure," he said, "and I will bring it before the full assembly for formal approval. I would ask, in turn, whether your government would be willing to resume limited diplomatic contact during this period, not to reopen the corridor negotiations immediately, but simply to maintain communication, so that neither of our peoples finds ourselves in this position of dangerous silence again." Bennett glanced briefly toward someone off-screen, likely Whitmore or another advisor, before answering. "We would be willing to consider that," she said, "provided the reforms your assembly has proposed are implemented in full, and provided the accountability measures already underway continue without interference from those who might prefer a return to the previous, more convenient arrangement." "You have my personal commitment to that outcome," Vorn said, "for whatever it may be worth, given the failures already committed under my leadership." "It is worth a great deal, Speaker Vorn," Bennett said, "provided it is followed by action, rather than simply another promise. We have heard many promises over the past 3 cycles. We have grown considerably more interested in outcomes." The session concluded shortly after, though the sense of relief that swept through the chamber felt fragile, tempered by the understanding that the crisis, while no longer escalating toward open conflict, remained far from truly resolved. I remained in the observation gallery long after most delegates had departed, watching the display screen return to its default status feed, the human fleet's positions still marked clearly along the border, still holding, still watching. Over the following months, I remained closely involved with the review board's early operations, working alongside a human representative named Owen Pierce, who arrived within weeks of the agreement's formal ratification. He was quieter than Bennett, more inclined to listen carefully before speaking, though I quickly learned that his questions during review sessions carried the same unflinching directness that had characterized every human representative I had encountered since the crisis began. Together, we uncovered additional incidents that had escaped even the expanded audit, patterns of neglect affecting smaller member species who had never possessed the diplomatic standing or military capability to force the kind of reckoning humanity had achieved through their withdrawal. I found myself, more than once, grateful that those smaller species now had an advocate within the review process, who could not simply be dismissed or delayed the way their own complaints so often had been in the past. The corridor negotiations resumed nearly a full cycle after the original withdrawal, though they bore little resemblance to the careful, procedural discussions that had characterized the original talks. Bennett returned to lead the human delegation once again, and I noted, with something approaching genuine hope, that the tone of these new negotiations carried a directness and mutual respect that had been entirely absent before. Grievances were addressed as they arose, rather than allowed to accumulate within some administrative backlog. Concerns were met with immediate acknowledgement rather than careful deflection. I do not believe the trust between our peoples was ever fully restored to what it might have been, had the original failures never occurred. Something had broken during those tense weeks when 600 human warships held silent position along a border that had once felt like nothing more than an administrative formality. And I do not believe that particular kind of breaking ever fully mends, no matter how sincere the reforms that follow. But something new had been built in its place, something perhaps more honest than what had existed before, forged not through careful diplomatic language, but through the harder, more uncomfortable work of genuine accountability. I think often of Bennett's words during that final tense exchange, about trust requiring sustained action rather than a single grand gesture, and I have come to understand that every institution, every relationship between peoples, ultimately depends on exactly that ongoing willingness to keep choosing honesty, long after the initial crisis that demanded it has faded from immediate memory. Corven retired from active diplomatic service not long after the reforms were fully implemented, citing exhaustion that I suspect ran deeper than he ever admitted aloud. Rel remained within the assembly, though her role shifted significantly, dedicating much of her remaining career to the very review board she had once viewed with such open skepticism. Vorn continued as speaker for several more years, presiding over an assembly that, whatever its remaining flaws, had at least learned to fear the particular danger of silence, dismissed as simple patience. I remain, even now, at my post within the review board, still working alongside Pierce and a growing team of representatives drawn from species across the assembly, still uncovering grievances that might once have been quietly buried, still working to ensure no population, human or otherwise, ever again spends months wondering whether their safety matters enough to warrant a genuine response. I think, sometimes, about that single massive vessel, holding silent position at the edge of our sensors on that fourth tense day, arriving without a single word of explanation, without a single shot fired, and yet changing everything about how this assembly understood itself and its own failures. I have come to believe it was never truly a weapon aimed at conquest. It was a mirror, held up before an institution that had grown far too comfortable mistaking careful procedure for genuine justice, forcing us, finally, to see clearly what that comfort had cost the people we claimed to serve. Humanity taught this galaxy a lesson none of us had expected, and few of us were prepared to learn. Patience, however remarkable, is never infinite, and the silence that follows its end is not an absence of communication. It is the loudest message a people can send, if only the rest of us are finally willing to listen.